Hello, everybody. Welcome. Happy Monday. If it's Monday where you're listening, some of you may be listening late, and I hope you're doing okay. Thanks for joining me and Jimmy here today to talk about grimdark and if it's more realistic or not. Now, Jimmy, I've been on your channel. You've been on my channel before, but do you want to introduce yourself
Yeah,
anyway
absolutely.
again, just in case?
Yeah, why not? You've gained a lot of subscribers since the last time I've been on, so
That's true.
congratulations.
Thanks. It's been a while.
It's like that Wheel of Time show I've heard. I heard a video or something.
We're not going to talk about Wheel of Time.
Well, Wheel of Time
not allowed. it's grimdark in my life now, but it wasn't previously. So,
oh well, for anyone who doesn't know, my name is Jimmy Nuts, and I come from a little channel called the Fantasy Nuttwork. Obviously, because of the name, you can tell that I review a ton of fantasy. I also do sci-fi, Stephen King, some other stuff outside, but it's mostly like 90.
Like it's more realistic. And you're a self-proclaimed nihilist. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair. I would like to give a distinction that I'm an active nihilist, because a lot of nihilism from its roots is people who see no point to anything, which I agree with, but I happen to find that to be a very motivating and freeing thing, which I know is very backwards, but I'm a complicated and sad individual. So
yeah, we're not. I mean, I was going to make that statement because you're not like laying on the couch, not like being like there's no purpose to anything.
Yes.
But I'm a self-proclaimed optimist. And so I really struggle when people are like, if it's grim, it's realistic. It's just tough for me. So I wanted to talk to you about that. You definitely read more grimdark than I do. And so anyway, that was kind of why I wanted you on. The first thing we're going to talk about is we just need to see what is grimdark. And I don't think it's an easy question to answer. And I think it changes my feelings about it a lot depending on, how people define it. So how would you define it?
Well, I think you had to look at the roots of it. And a lot of people point to the fact that it was used in the Warhammer 40K fandom. It was a way to describe something. I think it was like the grimness and the dark of the setting. And then it kind of took off from there. But, if you look back in fantasy, I mean, I would argue that Thomas Covenant, which was written in the 70s, I believe, it's pretty grimdark. I mean, you had a protagonist that does something absolutely dreadful within the first few chapters, and then you follow them along, and the main character has leprosy, right? And then commits a vile act because out of just pure self-hatred almost. So it's that is one of the more complex and nuanced characters I think I've ever read about. I've actually never finished that book. I would like to one day. I just haven't got around to finishing it. But thinking about like what grimdark is at its very basis kind of depends on what you qualify as grimdark, which we're going to have to figure out. But I think it's about a dark story with very complex characters that don't necessarily lend itself to a hopeful message, though I don't necessarily think that every grimdark story has to have zero hope. And that's the big point of contention that we'll probably have to talk about, because a lot of people say that is a key element of grimdark. But I think it's just a darker story. And one way I've heard it described, and then I'll shut up, is that it's the fantasy genre's answer to dystopian sci-fi. And I really like that. And I do think that some realism plays into this, but I don't necessarily think that it's more realistic. It's just showing another realistic side of a situation.
Yeah, wow. I've never heard that before. And I really like that, because when you think of when I think of the classic YA dystopia, like Hunger Games, people had a problem with that as a YA literature because it is pretty depressing at the end. Like if you read that third book, people were upset because it's not really happy. Have you read The Hunger Games?
I saw the first movie.
Oh, okay. Shoot.
You're fine.
Shoot, I thought for sure you would have read The Hunger Games. It's just the ending. I mean, this doesn't give anything away. Like Katniss is basically PTSD the entire third book, and it's not some triumphant ending. It really isn't. I guess that's what I'm going to give away.
Yeah.
And people, that's marketed to YA. That's a real different thing. So I was wondering about grimdark, because I've also heard grimdark has to be the anti-hero. And it's like, does it have to be an anti-hero, or can it be just a character who makes bad decisions, isn't like always doing the best? Like we were just talking about Dandelion Dynasty before we started. And I know you're just getting started, but that book is the definition of characters that are like very real to me. They're not necessarily doing the most horrible thing you could possibly do, but they're also not necessarily the people time either. And so, like, does it have to be an anti-hero, or can it just be characters that aren't a hero, period? Do you know?
Well,
does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I see some people like Matt and such are in the chat. They're actually saying Thomas Covenant's really about an anti-hero more than the world itself being grimdark. And I do believe that an element of grimdark has to be it has to encompass the tone of the world, right? Or it is just an anti-hero story. So Matt, you probably have more experience with Thomas Covenant than me. It was just the first few chapters that's kind of what I got out of it. And I'm thinking about like what stemmed this, right? A lot of people point to Game of Thrones, and I think that's pretty valid because it showed that it's marketable. And even Game of Thrones, I would argue, has hopeful moments, especially after just doing my read through. But I do think the world itself, it can't be one character. It has to be the world itself. And some of the message, I think, has to play into the not so hopeful part, but I still think there can be hope in grimdark.
So what about Sword of Kaigen?
Man, that's a good one. That's a good one. I would say
that's right on the line, isn't it? Because
it's on the line.
Grim and some grim things happen, but our main character can't really be called that gray, in my opinion. Necessarily, she follows more the hero kind of feel.
Yeah, and the tone of the story itself, though, I would say is very grim. Like that's a pretty good word, I think, to describe a lot of the stuff that ends up happening in that book. That's on the edge. But I've heard people call Mistborn Era 1 grimdark. How about that?
I don't feel like anything Sanderson writes can really be considered grimdark.
No.
There's just too much overcoming, and I mean, there's a reason he's my favorite author. That's like my jam. Like, Kaladin absolutely goes through a ton of struggles, always overcomes. I just feel like the overcoming is usually what's missing in grimdark. I just don't think everyone can overcome if it's a truly grimdark story.
Well,
do you feel that way?
I don't, because I think sometimes overcoming is actually a good thing, maybe for all, but maybe not on the individual level. Whenever, I mean, it's the price of the hero's journey, right? I think Fitz is a very good example of this, and not just Farseer, but just in all realm of the Otherlings. I mean, in theory, mission accomplished. However, Fitz is not the same guy. So there is an overcoming, but there's a consequence in there, and I think consequences play a deep role in why people say that grimdark is more realistic. And you were kind of saying how characters make decisions that aren't always good. That's pretty realistic. Like we are complex. We're complex apes. Like we are full of cognitive dissonance, and we're weird. We're weird.
Oh, absolutely. And sorry, I'll let you answer this question from Johanna, though.
Well, she said, Jimmy, would you make a distinction between nihilism and existentialism? I always associated more agency and possibly hope with existentialism, whereas I thought nihilism has no agency, no hope. Well, then maybe I am off on my definition, but I didn't really think of it as much as agency, as much as it doesn't really have an end impact, which I believe. I don't necessarily think anything matters. Which sounds so wrong.
No, it doesn't. No, this is a place where it's all accepted. Okay, this is the point.
All right, good.
Yeah, Alicia, that's the hard part. Is it just a question of characters? Because so do you view Farseer trilogy as grimdark?
I would say that if you take Realm of the Elderlings as a whole, I would consider it grimdark.
I mean,
which is interesting because there's some amazing characters in there. I would say there's almost some pretty like light versus dark things going on at times. But I think the root of the story is very sad.
I've only read the first trilogy, so take it with a grain of salt. But I mean, the second book was, well, I don't want to give anything away, but the second book was the first I've read of that kind. The ending of the second book floored me. Like it just, if you remember the ending of that second book,
yes,
floored me. Like I'd never read anything like that before. How could it end like that? One
of my favorite books of all time.
That I think, that's Royal Assassin. No.
Yeah, Royal Assassin. Yep.
One of the best books
I've ever read.
Ever. Yeah, agreed.
And one thing I saw Philip say in the chat, and I actually really like this, is he said that he doesn't think that violence and grimdark have, they might be included in one another, but they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that that's actually a really important distinction, because something like Mistborn is very violent. Very, very violent.
More violent than I think we realize. The other day, someone had like a fan art of a Steel Inquisitor, and it was pretty gruesome. And I was like, I never really thought about that. In my head, it's not very bloody. And like, wow, that is kind of gross. Like, why didn't I think that it would look so...
Right, and that doesn't make it grimdark. So there's more ingredients to the pie, right, or to the grimdark stew.
And I think, yeah. So I guess the reason I asked this question is because if grimdark can only be the worst of the anti-hero, the worst of the world, then I have a bigger problem claiming that that's more realistic. But if grimdark can be people trying to do their best, but ultimately being people and being in a grim world, it is easier for me to feel like that brings more realism. Does that make sense?
Certainly. So I guess that this might be where I break away from the crowd, and I think grimdark can be hopeful. And I don't think, this is where a lot of Tolkien people get on their high horse, and it drives me insane, is that everything has to be optimistic at the end. There has to be a positive message, and art has to make you feel good whenever you leave it. And I think that is just absolutely short-sighted. I think it's a really, really reductive way of thinking about art. I just don't agree with that at all. With that said, I think grimdark does edge into the territory of Little Hope, Prince of Nothing. I think, and this is up for interpretation, but I think Baker is offering a world there that doesn't have very much agency. I think he thinks that we are biologically inclined or programmed to make the decisions we were always going to make. And what would happen if someone were able to take control of that and see how you're programmed? I mean, that's kind of what he gets at, in at least the first trilogy. So in that world, I don't think there's any agency and there's no hope. I mean, it is very bleak. Can you give us some examples of titles you think is hopeful grimdark? Yes.
Sword of Kaigen, right?
Sword of Kaigen. I would say, would you count the Broken Earth trilogy? Because I think it's definitely grimdark.
I never even thought of Broken Earth being grimdark. It's pretty grim, huh? Maybe I do. If we're doing hopeful grimdark, then yeah, Broken Earth. I can handle some hopeful grimdark because I really liked Broken Earth.
Broken Earth, I think, is hopeful grimdark, and I stand by the fact that, and people will disagree, but I do think that Farseer or Realm of the Elderlings as a whole has a ton of hope, but it's hard to say that that world is not very bleak. Yeah, it's very bleak.
And Dandelion Dynasty as well. I got to interview Ken Liu, who is the author, and he said like he is a hopeful person. So I have the idea that it will probably end hopeful. I mean, right now, Kyle is in the chat. He would know. Oh, here you go. Kyle is saying that it's hopeful grimdark, but it's pretty dang grim. Like to the point where at one point I had to put the book down because it was like so upsetting. But I would say that the people, they're not doing the worst possible thing you could possibly think of,
Yeah. So I guess that's the distinction.
My headphones again. Okay. Hold on a second. Every time I do a live with you, Jimmy, with these headphones, it just...
I'm like Harry Dresden.
I don't know.
I affect technology.
There we go. I'm sorry. I don't know.
You missed my good joke. I said I'm like Harry Dresden. I get around technology and it starts
going, don't make Harry Dresden jokes. That's another thing we can't.
That's such a good meta joke. Such a good joke.
Another thing we can't bring up. Oh yeah, they call it Grimheart.
Grimheart. I love that so much. I love that.
So yeah, I think I do find those books pretty realistic in a lot of ways. So I guess I could, if we're talking Grimheart, I think I could get more on it. Because I read one of the SPFBO winners, Where Loyalties Lie. Have you read that?
I have not.
Anyway, I ended up DNFing that. It was like one of my first DNFs in like 8 years. My biggest, here's a question. Does grimdark always have to explore the deepest, most depraved things? Because there is like this line for me where it's like, okay, so I read Broken Earth, which has some really grim stuff. Like the main character as a mother does some pretty grim stuff, in my opinion.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily feel like anything in that book was like the most shocking thing I'd ever read. But then I read this book and it was like such a shocking scene. I'm not saying it's never happened, but it's about as depraved as I could imagine. And I think that's where I'm also like, okay, this isn't happening that often. Like this sort of like horrible thing.
So I don't think that it necessarily has to happen, but it is a piece of grimdark. And this is where I think some of the realism talk comes in, because we see things that just don't happen, because that can't happen because the story can't go that way. Right. So we see decisions being made. It's not that the optimistic or positive decisions can be made, but it's saying, hey, if there are wizards with this crazy power, could they be completely bankrupt on morality? And can they do horrible things with that? And have people in our world done horrible things with power? Sure. So I think that's like what people like to see. And for a lot of people, unfortunately, in the world, that is the reality, is that they are seeing these type of things on a daily basis. So I think it's more so that grimdark says, we don't care. We will go to any length to prove our point or to get a theme across or an idea, to different degrees of success. That's the other thing. There's good grimdark and then there's bad grimdark, right?
That's true.
Like anything, right? There's good heavy metal music that I really get into, and then there's some really bad heavy metal music, which I was listening to metal before I got on here because I had to get into my edginess, you know.
Good. You feel edged up?
This is correct. No disclaimer is correct. Would you consider Song of Ice Fire to be hopeful grimdark? I absolutely would, because Samuel Tarly exists. Samuel Tarly is
me being here, haven't read A Song of Ice and Fire.
Listen, we're not even going to get into that.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us into like the idea of do you think your life experiences and your outlook on life make a difference on whether or not you think grimdark is more realistic?
Absolutely. And the best example I can think of this is I'm reading through Berserk, which is, in my opinion, the most dark, depraved thing I've ever read in my entire life. Also, now that I'm getting further into it, I think that there's a lot of hope in Berserk. And there's a pride and a hope in struggling. But I know people who have went through some of the things that happen in Berserk to the characters that I could never imagine. And you would think that someone has experienced these things would not want to go through that again, or it would be triggering for them. But for some, and it is for some, but I've also found people who say, no, I feel seen. I feel like someone's finally willing to show like that side, because I saw that piece of humanity, and it terrifies me. And this story literally helped me move along. So in those darkest, deepest depths of humanity, that is somebody's reality most of the time. Now, obviously, there's not like trolls and stuff, right?
You're right. No, I know.
But the heart of the work, going to those extreme lengths to show scenes that we find to be despicable, can connect with people on a deeper level. And there's hope in that, to not be alone. Like, just to be seen is hope. So to say that grimdark can never have hope or anything, I think would be incorrect. But I also do feel that your life experiences absolutely, and also how you see the world, perspective's everything, impact the way that you feel about grimdark.
Yeah, and it's as a self-proclaimed optimist, sometimes it's hard for me to read books where everyone's just so terrible, because I just like refuse to believe that there aren't good people in the world. Like, it's just something like, to my core, I cannot believe that there aren't people out there not making mistakes, because everybody in this world, nobody has gone through this world and hasn't, done bad things or hurt people. That's just, it's not going to happen.
Right.
But the level of hurt that they've delivered is small. You know what I mean? Like, it's been hurt feelings or whatever, but not anything greater than that. Well, and so when I read, even though I loved it, I loved the first Flawed trilogy was great.
So I was going to ask. Yep.
Yeah, reading that and being like, everyone sucks. Like, everyone sucks. Even the people you think don't suck, they suck. Like, that was hard.
Well,
and I'm not going to give away who it was.
Well, as I say, there's someone that I felt was good, and then all of a sudden they have a moment.
You said his name. That's exactly. I mean, I was like, the only reason I'm reading this trilogy is because of that character. The only reason. And then
he lets you down.
Gut punches you.
And I guess, that was me. When I read that, I said, that's brilliant. I said, oh, that's so good.
Well, it was. I mean, as a whole, it is brilliant. It absolutely is, in the context of that story. Like, absolutely brilliant. That doesn't mean I have to like it. It doesn't mean that I have to like that this person, I was like, I can root for you no matter what. And then you're like, okay, fine. And that's hard.
Dogman is, I would say Dogman's almost purely good. I mean, if you ignore that he
was my favorite character. Is anyone surprised?
If you ignore that he murders people, which, by the way, like, that just gets ignored in all these conversations, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because, violence. If we talk about violence, like a little aside, I'm extremely sensitive to violence. So I do feel like I tend to notice violence more. In fact, you've read, are you up to date on Stormlight Archive?
Yes. Yes, I am.
So, I mean, I got yelled at in Reddit one time because I said that Oathbringer was hard for me to read. Like, Oathbringer was very difficult for me. those past scenes.
Yeah.
And I also had a 3-year-old at the time, which made a lot of the scenes very difficult because
Certainly.
there's a 3-year-old, some suffering on a 3-year-old in there. But and that was very violent to me. Like reading about the Blackthorn was very tough. And so I tend to not excuse violence very often in a book.
I actually
I do think
appreciate
it
that.
I think it gets excused a lot.
It, oh, absolutely. I mean,
Especially in American culture. Like we
the
really
West thing. Yeah.
don't care about violence in general. Like I won't watch TV shows that are too violent for me. I have to close my eyes. I use VidAngel. If anyone knows VidAngel, poor Zach has to cut out all of the like. I don't want to see people beheaded. I don't want to see people with their arms cut. I don't want to see it. The Witcher first episode, cut someone's head off. I'm done. Bye. Like I just can't handle it.
Well, I actually think that's fascinating because I feel like we are so desensitized to it our entire lives, which I guess being sensitive to it in a way is like a pretty good example of probably like what you were exposed to, right? Like growing up, right? So like everyone's backgrounds are so much different, but it is interesting that romantic scenes or assault scenes tend to resonate more, at least in America, I think, with people than violence. Like we can actually cheer on the big bad guy that gets revenge for us and serves out justice for us. And we don't think twice about that. For instance, there's a character in the Dandelion Dynasty who is out for revenge. And I had to take a second and go, wait, like I was cheering him on. I was like, wait, what's he going to do when he's in power?
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't have very good motivations, but most people probably just blindly go, yeah, kill him.
Do it. Yeah.
It's very bizarre. And I think that because of that attitude, that's why violence isn't an underlying like must in grimdark, though it seems to be in almost all of them.
Yeah, it seems violence does seem to be in all of it. And that's some of it just like sword fantasy in general. But it is interesting you say like going back to backgrounds, like, yes, I grew up very sheltered home, like couldn't watch kid shows if kids talked back to parents, definitely no violence, like very like never saw, an R-rated movie, like definitely all very, very low violence. And so I do think that has affected me growing up. I don't, seek those things. And also, I've had hardships like anybody, but in the grand scheme of things, not really. And so I do wonder if like, that's easier for me to be like, yeah, like life is good. People are good. It's fine. And I don't know. It's an interesting concept. Maybe that's why I struggle feeling like reading the first law and being like, yeah, all of these people, this is how the world is.
I think you acknowledge it to an extent though.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that's why we get along so well. I mean, you put a nihilist and an optimist in a room together, we end up having a great conversation. And I think it's because we kind of meet each other in the middle, because I don't think it's all doom and gloom. I really don't.
Yeah.
And I don't think First Law is all doom and gloom. There's a lot of humor in the little moments.
Well, and that's why I think First Law is really the only kind of true grimdark I've ever enjoyed, because it's hilarious.
Yeah.
Like that book makes me laugh out loud. It's funny. Like it is. I mean, Glock does hilarious. Like there's just
and Logan. And someone actually reading Rainbow said in chat, he said, my ex would watch true crime TV, tis tis, the murderers when they left the evidence. And actually, I was going to bring this up because I do feel like a lot of grimdark readers probably like true crime docs, which are my favorite things in the world. I've always been interested in like Ted Bundy, all these things, because that is a side of humanity that I was not exposed to as a youngin', and to know that that's out there. I feel like almost like I'm kind of readying myself if something bad were to happen. Like I know that exists. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. No, I know what you mean.
Like I never want to be like, I can't believe this happened to me. I want to be like, oh yeah, that does happen to people. So I've always been kind of into like true crime and the darker side of the human psyche. Because
that stuff is fascinating. Let's be honest. I think we're all fascinated on a level with that. Like, I watched a Ted Bundy documentary, which ultimately was a bad idea because it's terrifying. How he had a type, all of his women were like short and brunette. Like that's great for me to go.
Yeah,
watch. That is true. Killed 17 people that look just like you. Good job. Like, but there is a fascination. Absolutely. Like those people are so evil. It's hard not to be fascinated with what's going on in their brain, because you feel like,
well, we're both humans, but we're living different worlds.
Yes. Like you watch that documentary, you're like, Ted Bundy cannot have a normal brain. Like that's how I felt. Like when you watch those where they just kill people, you're just like, I can't believe that you are a functional human. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I have a hard time with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the most fascinating things in the world, that two humans can exist in the same world, but totally different realities. I mean, and that is ultimately what grimdark is to fantasy. It's a different reality that people can live in. And no disclaimer said, so there are no positive characters in First Law. I would say that there's a lot of characters doing the best that they can in the spot that they're at that moment. And if that isn't just, that's
Look,
it.
I'll be honest. I rooted for Logan through the entire thing.
Same.
I'm not saying he's a good guy, but
even when he did bad things, I was like, man,
good for you.
my guy.
Yeah, I was like, good for you, Logan. I'm on your side. And like, that is an interesting thing for sure about grimdark that I discovered in myself, is rooting for those people. Like,
Yes.
in the end, I mean, Dogman, I feel like, is about as perfect as you can get in that book. I was 100% on Dogman's side. And yeah, it's just very, even I'm not on his side, but even Glokta, there is a part of me that wants him to triumph in what he is doing. You know what I mean? You're like, well, I hope you succeed in what you are doing, even if objectively you suck as a person.
And he's relatable. I mean, a lot of us have been to jobs where we disagree with like fundamentally what the company that we're working for is putting out into the world. Like, we could fundamentally disagree with that and go, but it pays the bills. Like that's kind of where Glokta is. Like, he's like, well, better to do the torturing than to be tortured, because I've seen that side.
And this is a little off topic, but what's ironic about the First Law to me is the character I disliked the most, and the character I wanted the worst for was Jezzel, who objectively has the moral high ground. Like, objectively, he is.
How dare you?
The best person. Well, later on, I didn't feel that way.
Okay,
but in the first book, I
definitely
hated Jezzel. No, by the end, I feel terrible for Jezzel. Poor thing. But in the beginning, I hated him. Like, he was so sexist and misogynistic and just so self-satisfied. And it's so ironic to me. Like, I hated him because he's the person. I don't deal with a Glokta, I don't really know any Gloktas, you know what I mean? Or
Not
even
yet.
Logans in my life. But we all know the Jezzel. We all have the Jezzel, and that is interesting about grimdark, how it shows you like
your biases
for sure.
And also the fact that you're rooting for this person. And this is kind of where, like, I think you can take something away from grimdark, is like, you root for him to get punched in the face, kind of. You're like, I hope someone just knocks him out. But then you see him get humbled to an extreme extent, and you say, okay, that's enough. Oh, come on. All right, that's enough. And then you find yourself being sympathetic, and you say, you know what? Like, yeah, he was a jerk, but at the same time, he's still one of us. He's still human. So like that kind of builds like an empathy, for these characters that at first you thought you could never, like love or appreciate. So in the same way you were kind of turned on by West, Giselle kind of served the other purpose, right?
Absolutely. And okay, so do you think it's possible that those kind of stories can make you more empathetic to people then? Or
yes, 100%. I would never qualify Malazan as grimdark, because Steven Erikson himself said that's not a label I would attach to my work at all. I think he refutes it pretty strongly. But some of the grimmest moments throughout that series taught me a lot about empathy. And I also think that there's a lot of empathy in A Song of Ice and Fire when you look at the character of Theon, which I won't give any spoilers, but Theon is Giselle, the original Giselle, in a lot of ways. So there's just, I do. I think empathy is built into it. Now, with that said, I think there are works out there that are grimdark that are trying to glorify violence or trying to get me to react. Right.
And that's where I struggle. And that's why
me too.
DNFing that one book is I'm like, I just feel like you're trying to make me feel as bad as possible. Whereas like, I didn't feel that. And I do say that about Abercrombie's work. I say, I never feel like he's trying to be edgy. I never read that book and feel like, oh, he was trying to think of the darkest thing. Everything that happens in First Law feels pretty on board with what I would think happens in a war, or, you know what I mean? So that's something big for me, is like, this is going to sound a little judgmental. I do get concerned when I feel like readers want to read the most depraved thing possible. And like you said, maybe it's happened to them and they need that consensus. So like, I'm not going to, make a whole judgment, but it is hard when I feel like grimdark's like, let's see if I can be even worse.
Yeah, I have no interest in that. And I was very clear about this with Berserk, because Berserk is it's very hard to talk about. It's one piece of work that I love. As I'm going through it, I'm only about halfway through, but I will never recommend it to anyone. Never, not once, because it is a traumatic event in itself almost. And I don't say that lightly. Like, I really think that it has some of the most deepest, darkest things that I've ever read. But I wanted to be very clear when I started that series. I'm not here for like, ooh, did you see how gross that was, or how that was wild, wasn't it? Like, I'm not here for the oohs and ahs, but I'm here for the tone and the theme, and I'm here for lessons, and I want to take something out of this work and apply it to my life, or just understand people who have been through that type of trauma before, and maybe be able to connect with them better, because you meet people all the time, and you don't know what they've really been through. So I'm way more interested in grimdark, kind of like the true crime documentaries. Like, I don't watch those and I don't like go, can you believe Ted Bundy did? It's not that.
Yeah.
I want to know what makes him tick. And in this way, grimdark, I want to see what make some of the darkest characters work, or how do you find a way to move forward in a world that's so bleak? Where are those moments? Now, I have read works like Abercrombie's, in my opinion, very good at balancing it, but R. Scott Baker's Prince of Nothing has almost absolutely no joy in it. Like, I would say very few. I don't think I laughed ever in those books. But I still took something away from it. So.
Yeah. And that was interesting that you said, you don't think art has to make you feel good. I don't know. Just circle. I don't know how I feel about that. I can't answer now. I have to think about that statement a little bit. I don't know.
Have you ever listened to a song that made you cry?
If I ever listened to a song that made me cry? Well, no, I don't cry very often. My family does call me heartless. Just like full, like that's their joke, that I'm heartless, because I don't get emotional a lot of stuff. But I mean, yeah, I've read books that have made me tear up for sure. Yeah. But ultimately they made me happy at the end. So, I'd have to, it depends, I guess, what your definition of good is. Does it make you feel good? Like, what does good mean? Because good could be, I had an emotional attachment to this, and that is good. Or good could be happy, and those aren't necessarily the same things. Do you know what I mean?
I think as long as it makes you feel something.
That is true. I mean, the best artwork makes you feel something.
Yeah. And I don't think that art owes anybody anything to be a positive experience. There was a large, I think it was onering.net. They tweeted out something I just thought was so stupid. It infuriated me. And they said, we are being subjected to this abusive, nihilistic, entertainment like Succession and Game of Thrones week after week. And it's just like, that's the beautiful thing about art, is that you can just turn it off. Like, you're not being subjected. No one's strapping you down. You know what I mean? Like, I'm
the proponent of that. Just stop watching it if you don't like it.
And they act as if there's no optimistic, wonderful television shows on. I mean, The Mandalorian is very upbeat and positive. Get Disney Plus. It's not that expensive. You know what I mean? Like, so to say that something isn't art or is lesser art because it doesn't leave you with let's do it. I mean, I would also point the fact that the onering.net is ignoring the Scouring of the Shire.
I was just going to say that. Literally took the words out of my mouth. I'm like, did you read Lord of the Rings? Because the people's problem with Lord of the Rings, they think the movie is better because people hate the Scouring of the Shire.
Yeah.
Now, Lord of the Rings is as far from grimdark as you can get, in my opinion. But that moment itself is really tough, because you don't want that war to go to the Shire. But J.R. Tolkien experienced war, and he's made comments about how he needed to show that nothing is sacred when it comes to war. And that's
right.
That scene. And like, okay, fine. That made me really emotional when I read Lord of the Rings. Like, that part sucked. Like, you don't want it. It just sucks. And that was real. I mean, that was a real thing for sure.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people, it may have impacted them more than all of the positivity that happens in that story. So if they walk away from that sad and thinking about that and thinking about the consequences of war, that's a good piece of art, at least for me.
Yeah. And I will say, I definitely don't agree with that art isn't worth something if it doesn't make you feel good. Not at all. But for my own personal self, do I need art to make me feel good? Do you know what I mean? Which is a different question.
Totally fine.
In itself. Do you know what I mean?
There's no obligation. The problem I have is the obligation.
I just think it's very ironic that a Lord of the Rings website is tweeting that out.
Well, they're dumb. So
I mean, I've never heard of them, so maybe it's good.
They're massive. They have hundreds of thousands of followers.
Oh, I don't know. See, I don't know.
They can flame me. Yeah.
I just keep my own. Oh, LOTR spoiler. You know what? I do get in trouble sometimes for spoiling series like that. I'm like, it was written in the 50s. If at this point No, Radiant Reads isn't doing it. I know Radiant Reads, but I do get in trouble sometimes. And I'm like, look, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars. If you haven't seen it by now, that's your own fault.
Luke, I am your father.
Yeah, like, I'm gonna spoil it for you. Yeah, it's really interesting. There was a good question up here. I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it. That I thought was really interesting. Sorry, I can't find it. But they said, did you think there was a story that could have benefited from being more dark? Oh, here it is. And the reason I want to talk about this question is when we talk about realism, let's talk about the most hopeful stories we can think of, like the most optimistic, the furthest from grimdark you can think of. Would they have been more realistic, in your opinion, if they were darker? Now, that's an interesting question.
I mean, when I think of, and that's not to say that there isn't serious themes or anything, and I've only read one piece of the work, but when I think of like optimistic for some reason, or like happy-go-lucky, I always think of Terry Pratchett.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm not an expert in his work. I'm sure someone's going to say, no, he's actually very serious. I'm not saying he's not. I'm just saying that, like, I don't think I would ever leave a Pratchett book questioning my existence, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, the interesting thing about Terry Pratchett, the only reason I think Terry Pratchett's not a good example is I always say he's a genius. I mean, he just is a genius, and his stories hit so hard on social themes. I cannot believe they were written 30 years ago, because it feels like 2022. Like, he just really saw the social themes. So I will say he hits very real things. But it's all funny. Like, he never takes any of it seriously. So that's like a hard middle ground for me. It's definitely, I mean,
well, he makes layered work. So, I mean, there's definitely deeper messages, and it's, like you said,
because he's in the, I mean, I've only read like 7 or 8 Discworlds right now, and Good Omens. What have you read?
I've read Good Omens, and I read Mort, and I liked both. I liked Mort way more than Good Omens, though. Like, way more. Oh,
Jimmy, Good Omens is like one of my favorite books of all time. Although Good Omens was written with Gaiman, so it's not really like, it's very a hybrid of them. But more maybe Guards is a great example, and so is Weird Sisters, of things that just have like a ton of social commentary. But yeah, they're all hopeful. I don't think you could make his works dark, though. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
it would not be right.
It wouldn't work. But let's think of something like, Sanderson. Let's take the Stormlight Archive. Would it be more realistic if it was darker? If it had darker themes?
Well, and so I guess this is the part where, like, we say, well, grimdark's more realistic. I don't necessarily agree with that as a whole. I think that there are a lot of works that would be considered optimistic or not grimdark that are very realistic, and you could touch on the fact that Sanderson explores mental illness in his series in a multitude of ways, and that's a whole, you can pick that apart, and some people feel one way about it and another, but I think that for the most part, at least on the surface level, those are very realistic. So no, I actually don't think it would benefit that work. I really don't.
Yeah, that's probably not the best example, like you said, because there actually are some pretty dark moments.
Yeah, definitely.
Paladin, Rhythm of War gets pretty. Dalinar. Oh yeah, I barely could read Oathbringer, so there it was. So maybe that's not the best example of his works. I think. Well, what I think is actually it's a good example. Hold on, let me circle back. I want to say, like, not all non-grimdark works can't explore real themes. I think that's when I struggle, when people want to make the claim grimdark is always more realistic. It's like, well, there are very optimistic, hopeful books. No one say the Stormlight Archive is not a super optimistic, hopeful book. Sanderson is just, that is his brand. And he, all of it's going to be that way. But there's still very dark things that are explored. So I just don't like the caveat that a lot of people have of like, well, grimdark's always going to be more
this realistic. Is realistic fantasy. Everything else is hogwash Disney.
Yes, exactly. And I think, like you said, even within grimdark, like, there's a lot of range of grimdark from good and bad. And yes, some of that grimdark's going to be a lot more realistic than others. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I would throw Malazan with Stormlight in the fact that it's not grimdark, but very realistic and deals with some very intense things that actually happened in our world that makes people stop reading at some points.
Now, so that's interesting. I've always thought Malazan was grimdark. So this is like news to me that Stephen Erickson didn't like that. I've only read the first one, which did not feel grimdark to me, but
yeah, and I never want to speak for him, but just conversating and stuff, I do not believe he would be very keen on having his work labeled that way. And after reading them all and seeing the intent behind a lot of it, I would agree. I really would. That world is absolutely not one that's void of agency at all, and definitely not one that's void of hope, in a really positive message. In fact, the compassion and empathy is built in to the story. But it also depends on how you define grimdark. So it's it's a tough one. But
I mean, that's where you always circle around. I just think this is funny. Your upbringing. I do think it just goes back to your upbringing is going to have a huge impact on how you view the world.
Yeah. Joanna said, I just finished a grimdark book last night, and while I really enjoyed the themes and story, I don't think it was not realistic at all. Plus, I don't think it was meant to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's true as well.
Yes.
And there probably are books you're like, I just want to make bad things happen. It's sad, and I'm not trying to be realistic. I mean, that would be okay. If that attitude would make me happier when reading a book than someone trying to claim something realistic that didn't feel realistic. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I don't think realism is mutually exclusive to either side of the equation, whether grimdark or not grimdark. But I do think the grimdark just has the ability to say, I will do whatever I want, and we don't care. And that's how this is going to go. And I think that's where the realism comes, because it's, well, why didn't this character do this? Well, I couldn't do that because he's the good guy. Whereas grimdark says, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, let's let him do that. Let's let him mess up.
Probably would do that.
Yeah, like you probably would start to change if you had power, and probably do some really heinous things, especially if you find yourself in a place of power and you've never had it before and you've always been treated poorly. I mean, that's a very common one that I feel like I see in a lot of darker works. That does make sense to me. So
yeah, and that is a common story, I think, because it does. Yeah, it happens. Yeah. And where do you think, this was another question I had thought about and told you about earlier, but like, where does realism and escapism intersect? Because we are talking about fantasy. So ultimately, all of us fantasy fans enjoy something about the fantastical.
Yes.
That is obviously, I mean, every fantasy you read is technically not realistic, right? I mean, technically, on technical terms, because no one has magic powers. I mean, at least I'm not a truther. I don't think we have magic powers. So I don't think, any of that is real. So I just always wonder, like, are there some people who are just gonna be like, well, I don't read fantasy for realism, or why would you? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know people that are a part of my Discord that say that. Like, I don't want low fantasy. I don't want grimdark fan. I want stuff that's Marvel-esque, right? Like, yeah. I want stuff that's bigger than life, because I'm tired of reading about dude down on his luck that's getting kicked around by his boss. I do that every day. I'd rather see someone overcoming and being awesome. And there's nothing wrong with that. So that's a bit of escapism. I am definitely, for the most part, an escapist reader. And sometimes I go read about, Logan Ninefingers' life, and I go, wow, at least my life's not that bad.
So your escapism is being like, well, my life doesn't suck as much as that. So escaped.
Yes. And then sometimes, you see them doing the best for where they are, and it makes you want to try to do your best for where you are. You say, you know what? Like, maybe me right now sucks, but me in 10 years might not.
Yeah. And I do think something I've also thought about a lot is, like, we're all influenced by what we read at different levels. I read this book several years ago, probably almost a decade, called How to Be a Heroine. And it was a woman basically going back, looking at all the media she loved as a kid and how it affected who she became, basically, Was it a good or bad? And it made me think, like, I just don't know how much I'm affected. Like, do I read a book and think, well, they're doing this, so I can do it too? I don't know if I've ever felt that way about a book I've read. And so I wonder how that varies for people. Because I'm sure I know people have said they read about Kaladin as a really easy example because he struggles with something so many people just struggle with. So maybe viewing him overcome. I don't know if I've ever felt that way. Like, yeah, it might have happened subconsciously. So I don't know, how often do you read a book and feel like you are changing because of a character?
Well, what about Sword of Kaigen is what I would ask you. Did you ever feel a connection to that main character?
Oh yeah, I mean, I told you about that. I felt a huge connection. Now, did it change how I viewed myself or how I was going to act in the world? I don't know.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, that's a bigger question. Yeah.
It was more that I read that book and was reflected in it as I currently am. Does that make sense? So, like, I read that book and was like, this is a mirror to everything I have felt, but will it change how I am going forward? That's the question I can't decide.
Right. And it's hard to quantify that if it's happening subconsciously.
And you got into reading later, right? Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, I read as a kid, but I came back from A Song of Ice and Fire as an adult. I mean, that's really what kind of pulled me back in. Yeah.
And so it was like, how much of that kid reading have you noticed a difference since you started reading more as an adult? I never took a break. So maybe there are all of these subtle changes that I've just never known because I've just constantly been reading. Like, I don't know. It's just something I can't quantify, and that's interesting.
I would put at least $1 on the fact that you've been subconsciously impacted. Probably
at least $1.
Yeah, at least $1.
A lot on the line there.
Yeah, at least $1. So, I mean, has it ever impacted me? What I can say without any hesitation is that I have had books change me through themes and through looking at things through a different lens. My favorite authors are ones that flex perspective, which is why I really love Robin Hobb and George R. R. Martin and Stephen Erickson. I think that they flex perspective quite a bit, especially Erickson. But Realm of the Otherlings and Malazan definitely changed the way that I look at life. Like the last 10 months or so reading Malazan, I think helped me a lot with my worldview and how to handle people who you think are just fundamentally incorrect or immoral. And that's seeing them halfway and knowing that they think that they are correct. There are so many people in the world that the way they look at the world, I say, I can't understand how you see it this way. But whenever you take a second to think about how those people believe that they're right and they're doing the right thing and they're trying to do right by the people around them, like even though we think they're completely incorrect, that makes something a lot harder to just say, okay, you're not in my tribe, you're out. So I think that 100% seeing people go through trials and tribulations, but also seeing them lack empathy and then being wrong and coming to terms with it has had a pretty big, profound impact on me, especially in like the world and the way it is right now. And it has been for the, I don't know, last couple of years. So yeah, I think it definitely has had pretty monumental impacts. There's a spider on my wall. I got to kill it.
Okay, please do. I'm terrified of spiders.
Oh, I'm terrified.
No. You're not terrified because you're killing a spider.
Well, I missed, and now it's on the floor. Burning
you gotta go get it. We will wait.
There's cords. I can't. I don't. It's black. My cords are black. I'm screwed.
This is a quick. You are not afraid of spiders because when I see a spider in a room, listen. A, I've never killed a spider in my life. B, I will not sleep in a room for 5 days. Listen. If there's that is my minimum amount of time. If a spider gets lost in a bedroom, I am on the couch for 5 days.
But here's the thing. I've read so much grimdark fantasy that I now feel empowered to face my
kill the spider. So, okay, you need to make a list of your 5 top grimdark fantasies to help me deal with my spider arachnophobia.
With your arachnophobia? Okay.
I mean, it's so bad I've considered like therapy for it because like it's affecting my life. Anyway. So please tell me the grimdark therapy I can take. I just, you know what? I go back on it. Books have definitely changed my outcome. Like I was just thinking of like, I read Exhalation by Ted Chiang. Have you read that?
I have not, but he's like someone I really want to get to.
Yeah, because I just read that last year and I'm like, no, I profoundly was changed by a couple stories in there. So I'm like, okay, if I was profoundly changed last year, I am sure I've been profoundly changed at some point in my life. I just had to think about it.
Well, it's like artists, right, who end up making something, you're subconsciously impacted in your work. I mean, it just is what it is. Like you can cut everything off, but everything up to that point will somehow bleed through on the page or the canvas or the film or whatever you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I think is so interesting about making art, which is a whole nother conversation, about people's worldview. I do think like the authors that write, people are always like, oh, they're pushing their values on us. I'm like, they have no other choice. If you're creating a piece of art, it's going to have your values in it no matter what. Now, there are degrees of pushing values on people.
Yes.
So I'm never going to be like a free pass there. Like that's definitely not. I mean, there's garbage on Amazon. I don't know.
There's also good ways to do it, bad way. I mean, like anything, execution's everything.
But the idea that someone can completely divorce themselves from who they are as a person when they are creating art is just something I can't imagine. Whether you are trying to rebuff it or support it, you are doing something with who you are. And there's that famous quote who said it like after Tolkien, you either were influenced by Tolkien or purposely trying not to be influenced by Tolkien. That's how I feel about artists and what they put out. You're either purposely trying to go against what you are, or you're just naturally letting it bleed through to
Yeah.
better or for worse. I just think it's very difficult to keep yourself out of that. I don't know.
I think it's totally fine. You can have the best or the worst intent. If your execution's garbage, then
It doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right? But I also think that part of the craft that makes someone masterful is being able to write outside of their own experiences.
Definitely.
And I have a lot of respect, even though I don't necessarily think the execution is always great. I think Sanderson writes out of his wheelhouse.
He tries.
He tries, and
Really
he's gotten better at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I respect that actually a ton, because we can talk about sentence structure, we can talk about where you put a period, we can talk about paragraph pacing to chapter pacing to book pacing, but like that's also part of the craft, is like literally what you bring to a book, and also what you don't have, and what you research, and what you find out, and what you explore and write outside of your bubble. And the authors that do that, I think, are the best. And I also think that their works tend to reach a broader audience, and that it has a better chance of resonating with people over time. Whereas something, honestly, kind of like Prince of Nothing, I love it, but I think it's pretty much what you see is what you get in a lot of ways. And it's fun to figure out all the metafictional stuff that he does. I mean, he does some really amazing things, and I love his writing, but I don't necessarily think he's writing outside of his wheelhouse. He's writing about what he knows, what he believes, or at least what he thinks to be true in philosophy. Right. And it's fascinating stuff, but it's probably not that surprising that it only is a niche audience that really enjoys it.
Yeah, there's a lot of authors that I enjoy that only are really good at one thing, and they're good at what they do, and that's it. Doesn't really, I mean, okay, this might get me in trouble, whatever. But I think Andy Weir is that way. I really enjoyed The Martian. I really enjoyed, which one did I just read? I don't know, whatever one just came out. Project Hail Mary.
Yeah, Project Hail Mary.
I really enjoy those books. They're pretty much one thing. Yeah, we're not inventing the wheel. The characters are pretty similar. And that's fine. I liked it. So it's great. But yeah, you're definitely not getting a huge breadth of thought there.
Well, if to give a wrestling example that no one's probably going to understand, but for instance, Hulk Hogan, biggest wrestler of all time, I
know who that is.
Well, he did one thing, and he did it very, very well. Let me tell you something, brother. And he drop a leg, body slam big people. It was the same song and dance for a long time. But then you have someone who's an amazing technical wrestler, like a Ricky Steamboat or an Eddie Guerrero, that could do any type of style. He could do anything in that ring. Like anytime he got in, he would have some things that you knew were going to happen, but he would go outside of his wheelhouse. And to me, he was always a master of his craft. Hogan is the biggest star in the business. So like,
yeah, it's not always.
You don't have to go outside your wheelhouse. I'm just saying that I have a big respect for people who do.
Absolutely. This is a question that's actually very great. Hearing thoughts on portrayal of women in grimdark. This is actually one of the things I struggle with grimdark quite a bit. Yeah. Now I could just be reading bad grimdark. That's a possibility, but sexual assault tends to be a very big theme in a 100%. Lot of grimdark, and that can get very exhausting to read about, especially when it's not handled the best. It's actually something I respect so much about Abercrombie. In the 4 novels I've read, he always fades to black on assault, even though he writes very explicit scenes that are all hilarious.
That's so good.
He never, ever shows assault on screen. It happens because it is a very big reality, but it is never glorified. It is never, let's ruminate in exactly how terrible this is. You already know how terrible it is. He doesn't need to tell you. And it's something like I just deeply respect so much, because that is a problem I have. Like I read this grimdark and it's just so forward on that. And often the victims don't have the voice in the story. Yeah. It's the abusers that only have the voice, which makes it even harder to read. So like, you've read a lot more grimdark than me. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm by no means an expert. Slowly Read is a great channel. He is an expert in grimdark for sure. So yeah, there's quite a lot of work.
I know it's a loaded question, so I apologize. I know.
No, it's fine. No, because it's one of those things where I've seen it done really well, and I've seen it done not so well. And I think Abercrombie had a lack of female representation in the first Law trilogy, and then made up for it tenfold in the sequel trilogy. That I think, for me,
everyone's told me that.
I think it's some of my favorite female characters. I mean, just tremendous works. I do not think that assault of any type has to be in a piece of work to be grimdark. I think something grimdark does not have to have these things. However, whenever you talk about the worst of a human psyche, that happens to be one of those things. However, that doesn't mean you have to write poor women characters, right? So for me, I will always stand by the fact that if you write bad women characters, then you're bad at that portion of writing. Like, you're doing bad writing. So have I ever read any good? I mean, yeah, I think so. I think that if I count Robin Hobb or George R. R. Martin, I think that they both have really wonderful female characters. Not to say that they're perfect by any means, but also Esme from Prince of Nothing is an interesting one. And I've actually seen a couple other booktubers review books, and they were female, and they said, female representation in this book is terrible. So I would probably have to take their word for it, because I'm a man. So like, I don't necessarily think I should say, well, I think I'm correct in this stance, because I think they probably have a better idea of what that representation looks like. However, I actually really like the character of Esme. I hated everything she went through. She's the harlot that's the only way to really describe it. And she goes through some heinous things, but her pain and her suffering is like acknowledged. And so that's tough. It's like, do you not include it? Or if you include it, can you do it well? And I guess that's probably where the variance lies, is whether or not it's well executed. Was it done for shock value? Did it actually have an impact on the character? Does the character grow? And Esme is a really complicated one. And I also think that the philosophy in that series is probably not the most optimistic when it comes to being a female in that world anyways. So that's a tough one to recommend or defend, I guess. But I liked Esme as a character. Even though
and I think you hit some really important things, which is, was the scene necessary? Did it move forward the story, and did the person have a voice? Because the truth is assault is just like a very big reality. Like, the reality where it's like, if you're writing a realistic world, like it is the reality. So I have no problem with that being included in books. I would think it'd be hard pressed to find a woman who doesn't know someone in their life that's been assaulted. I just think it would be hard. It's hard for me when, though, particularly male authors take it for granted that it's happening with no thought of what the consequence of it is.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the biggest problem. If you're writing a book to make the most shocking thing happen, you most likely are not really thinking about what that actually means for the character who is experiencing it, which is where I have the problem. I don't have the problem with addressing the thing. It is, are you giving proper attention to the outcome of what it is? Did you read The Grey Bastards by Jonathan French?
I actually did. I read it last month.
So one of my big problems with that book is, and this isn't like a spoiler, so I'm just going to say it. They set up a society where basically a female half-orc's biggest goal in life, like if you want to have made it, would be to be the favorite prostitute of a Grey Bastard. Yet all of them were extremely happy in their role to be there. And my biggest issue was like, that's fine if you set up a world where that is the case, because that's not beyond reality for me. But the beyond reality is that everyone's super happy and go lucky and loves their role. Like, that was so beyond the reality of sex work and assault that I was just like, I kind of laughed. Like, I was like, okay, that was like a men writing woman moment for me. And that's when I struggle.
Well, also, like, so he can do that. That's fine. There's nothing to say he can't. But what I would say is, man, you did not get enough out of that. You could have got a lot more out of that. Right?
Yeah, or push it further. I agree with you. Have to make a statement. It can't just be there like that. Do you know what I mean? And so that's when I do struggle a lot with grimdark. Like, and the one thing that you're right, Abercrombie didn't really have the greatest representation in First Law, but the women who were there felt like somebody to me. Like, you have, especially Artie. Artie is one of the best examples of a character, in my opinion, who uses sex to get ahead without becoming a caricature of what that means. Artie was like a very complex person. She had a lot of feelings and thoughts, and yes, she was someone who used, sex appeal to get ahead, but it never felt a character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And and I'll be honest, and this is probably my bias or something, but like I didn't notice that there wasn't great female representation in First Law when I read it, but then when someone points it out, you go, "Oh yeah."
Yeah, and I think it's because there just aren't very many female moments. You really don't hear from Artie or Pharaoh as often as you hear from the other male characters. But for me, their representation wasn't bad. It wasn't maybe as much as I would have liked, but the characters still were characters. They were still people with a lot of complex thoughts and emotions and, and motivations, which for me is better than a female character that gets a lot of attention that sucks. So like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I can't sit here and say that I know the recipe for all these things because it's very difficult. And also I don't think I can say here's what I think of Portrayal and Grimdark because I haven't read enough of. I mean, I've read a decent amount, but I haven't read everything, and making genre-wide sweeping statements about something like this is really difficult because you can't undo that once you say it, and you could be I'm wrong a lot. So
and it's also hard because I am a woman. I cannot speak for all women about what good representation is, and I talk about that a lot. Like, this is good representation to me. Another great comment. My suffering makes me stronger. It's just one of those interesting things because assault tends to in life happen more to women that way, sexual assault. That it is something that's uniquely there. So I understand, but it is difficult. Just a difficult waters to tread, and I just felt like people could be, more careful about it, I guess, when we're using grimdark as a backdrop.
And that also goes for any author. Being very purposeful with what you're doing. That's something that is, even as someone who likes to write, that is something that I never realized how important it is to literally think of every single thing that you do. So I have a short story where I have two factions of the military, and it's I love alliteration, so you all can make fun of me, but it's the Sworn Sisters and the Bronze Brothers. And I didn't even realize that I'm just installing a patriarchy like directly in, like, you know what I mean? Like I'm saying these things are different. They're not all mixed in. Whereas something like Malazan, like all female and male, like they're just Marines. Like it doesn't matter. And it's interesting to see that I fell back on that to splitting them up. I didn't think about it.
Well, and that's such a good point too. I always talk about that when people say, well, it's realistic in fantasy. I'm like, we are in a fantasy world. You cannot tell me what is, like, once magic is involved, you're in a fantasy planet, a fantasy country. If it's not taking place here, then you don't know how that, went. And so I do think I find stories very interesting that actually purposely play with those types of things that we do take for granted. I'm not pretending I don't. I take it for granted all the time. And it's about, subversing those expectations that I think make the best writers.
Yeah, and I also want to state there's nothing wrong with like splitting them up. It was just like I didn't think about it, and like I didn't want that. Actually, that was one of the things I said. I said like, oh, I just want it to be like people are people. I want to make it kind of like an even playing field, and I just like defaulted to that. So like it's very important. Especially,
it's not that it's wrong. You're just saying I didn't think about it, and I want to know why I didn't think about it.
I literally went against one of my original ideas for my story. And I just fell into it. So it happens with authors. And it can happen in Grimdark. I think it's a little bit more painful in Grimdark because we're dealing with things that are very heavy and things that do affect people. And they're coming to this for a certain reason to get something out of it. So then to see it done at all poorly feels like a bit of I think a little bit more of a slap in the face. But there's plenty of non-Grimdark stories that have, assault in them that aren't well done. So.
No, absolutely not. It's not. It just tends to be, in what I've read, more openly or explicitly talked about in Grimdark because, like you said, they maybe feel the permission to do so. Yes. So I think that is where it is different. Whereas more of the, I don't know what we're calling them, the happy books, optimistic books don't feel the license to be able to do it in an explicit manner, at least. Yes. And so I think that is where it feels like it happens more explicitly or frequently in Grimdark. It's like you said, they have permission to explore that.
And on top of that, there's like, people who don't like Grimdark, maybe you're watching this and you say, I'm sick of all this nihilism. I'm sick of this pessimistic attitude. I feel like heroic fantasy is kind of on an upswing because of this. It's ebbs and flows, it's waves, and like,
people are saying that, but I feel like Grimdark is like the thing right now. Am I missing the upswing back to heroic fantasy?
Well, who's the #1 selling active author?
I don't know. Who is it?
Sanderson. It's
Is
Sanderson.
it? Okay.
Oh,
That's what I was going to guess.
$48 million.
I mean,
Come
okay.
on,
He got
come
$41
on.
million. I mean, if he wasn't before, I guess he is now. I mean,
It's-
the biggest net worth, though, he's the biggest, you're saying active selling. Okay. So
Yes.
I was like, JRM, definitely.
He's still
has gotta be
bigger.
the biggest. Yeah.
He's still, but you know, that will change. But I think it's very important to look what's selling now. So like the fact that Gurm was huge gave us Joe Abercrombie in a way. And, you know, the Mark Lawrence is probably somewhat, you know, marketable because of that being popular. And we saw a bunch of people kind of emulating the grim dark feel, or at least a little bit more of a nuanced character feel. And now that Sanderson's big, you're going to see people who are probably going to go more with that tone. And then eventually you'll see someone say, I want to take Sanderson and I want to make it grimdark. You know, I mean, there's always going to be people
a circle.
What it comes down to, folks, is just literature. Like at the end of the day, it's just literature. And a lot of stuff that we say about grimdark tonight could be said for the whole genre, I think.
Absolutely.
I'm trying.
Do you think optimists will likely not enjoy grimdark? Jimmy identifies as a nihilist, but do you think that would be on par for most grimdark fans? I don't think so necessarily.
Yeah, you're like my you know, my example. Like, Bookborn loves life and loves First Law.
Well, yeah, but I always joke, do I like grimdark or do I just like Joe Abercrombie? And the more I read, the more I go towards just like, I think Abercrombie, because even First Law, I would never reread it. I loved it.
Really?
I don't think I'd ever reread it.
But you're going to read on, right?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to finish all of it. I want to finish all of it. But would I go back and reread? Probably not. It gives me the sads a little bit. And like, I don't know if I'm someone who just wants to like subject myself to the sads all the time. You know, that's it about me, I guess. But I mean, I don't know, because I would totally reread Sword of Kaigen, which was like such a profound book for me.
So good.
And you know, but I think the grimdark that I would tend to read more is definitely Grimheart. Like I could see myself rereading Dandelion Dynasty, but there is vestiges. I'm going to be so interested when you're done with that series. I really hope you like it. I just really feel like you're going to like it a lot.
And they're all out, right? And you've read them all?
3 are out. The 4th one, I have the arc of sitting on my shelf. It comes out in June, so I'm reading that in like a week with Kyle.
Well, maybe I'll take notes, like spoilery notes, and then we can
talk about it.
Yeah, maybe even each book. Like I'd be down with that. That'd be cool.
I would too. I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Can I read something?
Yes.
Okay. So this is no spoilers really. I'm gonna keep it very vague and then just try to read the quote poorly out loud. But this is and again, I don't consider Malazan grimdark necessarily, but it does deal with some really dark stuff. And there's an abuse of a younger character, and it happens off page, but it's really impactful. And this is the quote. It's really heavy. We knew he wanted her, yet we did nothing. They are human after all, and it is human nature to transform loss into a virtue, so that it might be lived with, so that it might be justified. Talking about my being assaulted and then I overcame it. My weakness made me, or my transgressions made me strong. Whatever, not transgressions, but you know what I'm saying.
I know what you meant. Yeah.
And I love this. It's like almost saying that, like exactly what that is. It's like, after all, it is human nature to transform loss into a virtue, so that it might be lived with.
That's a pretty powerful statement, that whole thing. But also like we did nothing because we're human and humans do nothing all the time. That just hit me a little bit.
I got chills. I literally have chills. Erickson is he's so good.
I mean, I am going to be reading, as you know, Malazan. I'm going to get there. So maybe we can talk about that when I finally, I told you after I read Gardens of the Moon, it was, 11 years ago, maybe. I just thought I'm too stupid for this. I literally was like, I'm too stupid, because it was like one of the second or third things I read that was adult fantasy. And now I know that everyone feels that way. So I'm very excited to get back into it and know that it's okay to feel stupid when you read Malazan.
Listen, I read Malazan in 10 months. If I can do it and understand all of I can do it, you
understand those things more than me.
No, no, I became a better reader. I became a better reader because of Malazan. Oh yeah, Kyle says he's an optimist. He also loves grimdark.
Yeah, I just thought that was funny. That was, this is random, but I'm reading Harry Potter to my son, and for the first time, I'm very excited. And he wanted to take a sorting hat quiz, and I won't let him take the real one. But anyway, that's a whole nother. He has to wait till he's 11. It has to be done right, But I wanted to find one that didn't rely on book knowledge. This is way too long of an explanation. The point is, I found one that was like, what do you like? Air, water, fire? You know, something very one. And one of the questions was, you see someone being bullied, what would you do? And, you know, all of us in my family took this and answered, oh, we'd go and help. And I had this moment of thinking, would I though? Like, would I, if I was out on the street, not because I think so, not because I didn't want to, but because I would be too afraid to be honest. Not because I wouldn't want to help. And so your quote just saying that reminded me of that. Like, I think in our hearts, we think we would help, but I had this honest moment with myself that was like, depending on the situation, would I help? I always wonder, would I speak up? And sometimes I have, and sometimes I haven't. And that's just like an interesting.
I mean, you see videos of like grandmas being mugged on a subway, and you're like, why is everyone filming? Why isn't anyone stepping up? And it's because it's a lot easier to do nothing.
So like that quote felt very grim to me, but grim in a very realistic way of like, yeah, that kind of sucks. Maybe I don't like reading grimdark because I don't want to see reality reflected back at me.
I mean, I think it resonates. I think it's true. And again, I have to be so on the nose about this, but I don't think Malazan is grimdark at all.
No, actually. I know you don't. I'm just saying that particular.
I'm saying, look at this dark situation and how it's handled. I think Erickson handles that abusive situation in that book phenomenally.
Yeah, that was. Maybe what book is that in?
House number 4. Number 4.
Okay.
But don't worry, Dead House Gates book 2. We can talk about one of the most complex and nuanced situations I've ever read. So
gotta get there. That'll be a while, so we'll see. But yeah, that was just an interesting thought I had the other day about like, yeah, maybe we'd like to think more of ourselves sometimes than what we really are, and maybe that is reflected sometimes in. And maybe going back to the escapism thing, I do think sometimes I do feel the escapism in reading about the person who always does the right thing and has the heroic moment, because I think there's a part of all of us who also wants to be that person, I think.
Yeah. And you know what? I think grimdark also takes a step to show you the bully's perspective.
Definitely.
And think about that, though. What happens to that bully? I always say this is always my example when I talk about power of perspective, is if you go in, you're in a McDonald's, so you're obviously already having a bad day. But you go in, you're in McDonald's trying to get your Egg McMuffin or whatever you're doing, and you see a dude at the counter, and he's just just going off on a worker, and you think that guy is such a jerk. That guy is the worst. And he leaves, and you say that is one of the worst. That's what's wrong with society. But like, you didn't know what happened. Like, you might have seen him at his very worst moment of his life. And who knows, like, what if he found out that his mother passed away right beforehand? Now, I'm not saying it excuses it. That's not what I'm saying. But with that more context behind it, you see that from a totally different perspective. And in grimdark, I feel like a lot of the times it's putting you in the shoes of people that it is really easy to hate, because it's easier to hate or love, like it fall in one or the other camps. But grimdark makes you kind of look at the context and where's the responsibility lie within the character that is doing this awful thing, but also the responsibility of the people who have maybe pushed this character to this place. I think Rin from Poppy War is a really great example, and one of the most polarizing characters I think I've ever come across. And I don't blame people who say they don't like reading about Rin, but at the same time, I say Rin didn't start out this way. Who made her this way? Not saying she's not responsible, just saying there's a tragedy in there of two different flavors.
I mean, even using the first law example, that was one of the most depressing things to me, is we saw people trying to be better and then ultimately being pushed down. And you can understand it, but that is one thing that's hard for me to read, because it's just so depressing, because there is a reality to that there's a lot of people who are going to try their best and just never make it there.
In the way that society is set up, at least here, someone has to be at the bottom.
Yep.
I always felt that way when I sold computers at Best Buy. You know, you always got to try to be number one in attachments. You got to get the accessories and the Geek Squad support. And at the end of the day, you're always like, well, somebody's got to be last. And if you were in last, you got rode up. So it was like, so someone always has to be in trouble. So it's like this underlying fear that's being instilled.
Before you explained why, I just thought working there is the reason that you felt like someone else had to be on bottom. And as
Well,
someone who
that
worked
too.
as a grocery store clerk, I felt that in my heart because some jobs teach you to have just a little bit more empathy for people selling you things.
I'll tell you
Anyway,
what, I remember, you know, you want to hear my grimdark moment
okay.
is so whenever I was trying to be a pro wrestler and I was making really good progress, and it's the only thing I've ever been really good at in my life. And I felt like a superhero every time I would wake up and know that today was the day a show was on, right? And I always said, like, thank God I have this passion. Thank God that I have something to focus on. All my energy went into this thing. And then it was taken from me. I got injured and all this stuff happened and I ended up having to quit. And I remember shortly after I lost a job that I really enjoyed, they outsourced our department. It was tech support. And I ended up going and working at another place that I won't name. And I never want to be the person like hated their job. And I became that person. I had like an hour commute one way. So it was 2 hours driving every day on a really dangerous highway. And I was at like the lowest point of my life, maybe like possibly the lowest point of my life. And I realized how fast you can go from feeling like a hero to feeling like absolutely nothing. And I see a lot of stories that revolve around people going from a very high spot, like Giselle, to a very low spot. And I got news for you. Whenever I thought I was the hero, I was not the best person. I was not nice to everyone. I did not take time to think of people who were working their way up and such. But when you get humbled, you start thinking a lot about these things and how you treated people. So I think that in a way is why these kind of stories resonate with me, because I feel like I've really seen like the top of what it is to be at your ambition at the highest peak, and everything's going right. And I've seen it all come crumbling down, where you don't even know why you want to get up the next day. So I think I just resonate with characters that see both sides.
Well, Glock is like that too in a lot of ways.
Yes, I relate with Galactica very much.
And that's why I think Glockta is also, I agree with Benjamin.
Thank you, Benjamin.
I think that's why people find him so fascinating, because I always say it's like, oh, the attractive war hero when he comes home. You rarely get to see the attractive war hero come home, but like, oh, the reality of war is that you're probably going to be missing something, whether physically like Glockta or otherwise. That's interesting, that point you bring up about Jezzel, because it is true. He falls, but I like him more as a person after he does.
I'm a better person. Maybe this is the whole like struggle, you get be a better thing, but like I'm a better person now than I was 10 years ago. And if people compared to what I'm doing now to what I did then, people probably think it's a lot cooler wrestling in front of 1,000 people in your underwear or whatever. But
I watched the videos. It was very cool.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I don't watch a lot of that sort of thing. You can probably imagine, as I've talked about, violence in general. Even though that's like constructive, like mutual violence.
Right. I like that. Mutual violence. That's a very good way to put it. Yes.
Well, thank you. That's a very profound story. And interesting, like you said, you see those things reflected, which is why it feels realistic. Yeah. Again, realistic, going back to what we talked about earlier, is so much a product of your own story being told back at you. And maybe someone reads Sword of Kaigen and thinks her burying the sword is stupid. And I'm over here when I told you, just like, oh, that spoke to every
of the best
moment
moments
of me becoming a mother. Like, it reflected back the experience I had already had. And maybe that's the crutch. Maybe it's not grim, dark, or hopeful, or whatever it is. It's whatever we see our experiences reflected back at us that is realistic.
Yes.
And sorry.
No. Go ahead.
No, that's it. You can go.
Well, I was just going to say, so, I mean, I think if anything, that's what like people should take out of this, is that I hope if you've come to this and you think that grimdark is just the oohs and the ahs and the gross me outs, I think there's a lot more there's a really profound and tremendous experience waiting for certain people who are looking for a certain thing. Maybe people who also feel very counterculture or anti-hero. Like there's a place for you. And I think that's why you're seeing fantasy kind of it's splintering in a way.
Hmm.
And some of that's good and some of that's bad, right? Like
Right.
that's a whole nother discussion, right?
I know. We could like go on for hours about our offshoots on this discussion.
Or like whether or not the label matters, you know?
And I don't think it does ultimately.
Yes.
I think the label of like this is good fiction versus bad fiction is more interesting
Yes.
and a useful label. But
and that's kind of what we've reverted to, right? Like we've kind of always reverted back to like, well, this isn't even grimdark, but look at this is a great way of doing something super dark.
Yeah, yeah, totally. You're like, you don't want to give it that label because then the preconceived notions come with it, which is tough.
And there's already enough preconceived notions. I mean, for instance, Grace of Kings has like 3.7 stars on Goodreads, and I kept pushing it down. And now I'm reading it, and I'm like, this is the greatest example of Goodreads being worthless.
It makes me so sad that people.
It's so good.
It's such a good book, and the second is even better. So like, I always want to be like, it's just, oh, the second book is so good. I think this is a side note. I think people struggle with Grace of Kings because it is a very big slow burn, and I think that like is hard. Like you have to commit to it to get, you
have to engage with it.
You have to engage with it. Yeah. But so I guess kind of, wrapping up a little bit, would you say one of the main reasons you read grimdark is because you feel like it's more realistic?
I would say that I like the realism it explores,
okay.
which is usually not the type that's going to make you feel bubbly. So I would say yes, even though I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, I do think that is whenever grimdark is doing something like that I do find realistic, that yes, I enjoy it a lot more. And I like low fantasy. So
yeah. And do you, taking away labels completely, do you look for realism in your fantasy?
That's a good question. Not as much anymore. How about that?
Ooh, okay. Why?
I'm a broken record, but Malazan.
Okay, Malazan fundamentally has changed you.
Yeah, Malazan is as high fantasy as it gets. I think it has some of the most epic, ridiculous scenes ever in all of fiction. And I realize that you can still do all those things and still have a very impactful message behind it that connects to you on your everyday. So.
Yeah, because I don't think I would have ever said that realism is a reason I read fantasy. I don't think so. Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm unself-aware. I also do tend to like high fantasy versus low fantasy. Abercrombie's low fantasy was a little bit of a moment for me, but I worked through it and I liked it. It was like,
well, you get a little something at the end.
Like, this isn't even fantasy. And my husband's like, it's literally in a made up world. And I'm like, well, that's barely fantasy. Just because it's not on Earth doesn't mean it's fantasy. I need magic. But so I think that's part of it. Because I do think high fantasy in general tends to be more on the like, I don't know, just on a different kind of realism scale, I suppose. But it's interesting. You've given me a lot to think about as I go forward reading The Heroes, which will be soon.
That book is that's a divisive one, but it's probably my second favorite standalone, I think.
We'll see. The Heroes is about a 3-day long battle, which I would never read in a million years if everyone wasn't telling me I had to read it to get to the other stuff. So we'll see. We'll find out, I guess, how it works out. But so I think ultimately, let's see. Let's sum up. To sum up,
our closing paragraph in our 5-paragraph paper.
The label doesn't matter. Oh wait, hold on. Alan jumped in to be like, the teacher's at the bottom of the pecking order. Probably true. So that's our grimdark to leave on. The label doesn't matter, really. Realism is going to be realistic, but grimdark offers the opportunity to maybe explore parts of humanity that aren't as explored as often with permission in typical like fantasy.
Yeah. And yes. And I think some people want to peel back the hood and see the ugliness that humanity can be. So
yeah, I think that's a great way to say it. And what did we learn today? Students, friends, colleagues, what did we learn today? Because hopefully from one of my videos, you learn something every time we talk. I learned something today. I actually do think I will view things differently. This conversation has fundamentally changed me, Jimmy. Maybe my fantasy happened, but I will make the conversation fundamentally differ how I view grimdark going forward. And realism. I don't know. Just an interesting conversation. Thank you for having it with me. And being willing to talk about the tough stuff.
No, I absolutely always love talking to you. I think that people with such different outlooks on what life is or what it means or whatever, all that nonsense, right? The fact that it can be so opposite for us, but we can come together and have quality conversations and see each other's points, I think is probably something we need more of.
Yeah. And, I've noticed BookTube has been BookTube creators have been super great at that. It's something I've noticed specifically. I don't know if it's all creators in general, but on BookTube, had a chance to talk to a lot of people who just have no problem having very different views, but not being defensive about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm fine with you. I'm good friends with Leanna. Leanna and I have some very different book taste. And we love that. We laugh about it all the time. And just being able to talk with people who aren't threatened by different views is very interesting. I've just found it a lot on BookTube, interestingly.
Yeah. And also approach is pretty big on how we do that. And I'm always working on that. And sometimes you can't catch me on a bad day, Of
course. I mean, I have canonical videos of me on a bad day. Like, it's fine. We and I don't think it always has to be perfect, but it has interested me. And I do to make a judgment. This has been said a lot. I actually don't think any of the statistical studies are really worth anything. I've looked into them, and the thing about stats is you can make numbers lie, and not all data is collected the same. But I do tend to think readers do get to experience so many different viewpoints that readers often can be comfortable exploring that more deeply than those who don't read a lot. And that's something I feel to be true. I can't prove it is true, but I feel it to be true.
Yes. And I think that those kind of works. Sometimes I like just the spectacle of reading and just enjoying and being entertained and having a almost passive experience. But it tends to be that my favorites and the ones that stick with me and that create the palette of my taste are the ones that ask those questions. And maybe sometimes don't even have the answer and let me answer.
Well, the best books don't tell you the answer, for sure. Yeah. And I think ultimately, this goes back to the heart of it. A book that is going to be the best is a book that makes you feel something. Whatever that is. When I think of all my favorite books, it's because I felt something. I knew when I read Sword of Kagan, it was going to be a top 5 book of the year. It didn't matter that I read it in February. Like, it didn't matter because I felt something. Same with Piranesi, which is on like the opposite side. Like, I read that book and I felt something from it though. And that's ultimately grimdark or hope or whatever. That's going to be the end all be all.
Yes, right. That is good literature.
Good literature makes you feel something. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on this discussion. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining me. It will not be the last time. We'll talk Dandelion Dynasty and Malazan whenever I get around to it. Good night, everybody.